Welcome to the crash course. Today we're going to be discussing the characteristics of living and non-living things, as well as the parts of animal and plant cells. This video is meant mostly for Secondary 1 and Secondary 2 students, and we divided it into two videos. The first part is going to be where we discuss the characteristics of living things, and then we talk about the differences between living and non-living things. And in the second part of the video, we're going to be talking about animal and plant cells and the differences between them, as well as their different organelles or parts. So living things, which are also called living organisms, are incredibly diverse. So if we want to look at an example, we have an oak tree, and an oak tree is obviously very different than mushrooms. And if we look at a lion, it is very, very different than itty-bitty bacteria. But no matter the living organism, they all have 7 characteristics that they have in common. So let's explore that. So the first characteristic that we're going to explore is that all living things are made of cells. So what is a cell? Well, a cell is the smallest unit of life. So in other words, it's the smallest living organism on the planet. And when we cut open a cell, like for example, we have this animal cell right here. When we cut it open, it has all of these parts inside that can't function on their own. So like this guy right here, this round part in the middle of the cell, it can't function solo. And if we look over at our plant cell here that's been cut in half for us, this blue part right here, it can't function on its own. So everything is connected within the cell. So when we're talking about organisms, we can actually divide them into 2 categories. The first category being unicellular organisms. These organisms are so tiny that we need a microscope to see them. And what's cool about them is they're composed of 1 cell only. So we have some really cool examples that you probably have heard of, like for example, bacteria and protists, 1 cell, very simple. And then we also have algae and yeast, certain types of them that we need a microscope to see because they're super duper small. And then we have the other category. This category are multicellular organisms. They are composed of many cells. They're also more complex than unicellular organisms. And the best example that I can think of is the human. So our human bodies are composed of trillions of cells. We have skin cells, we have brain cells, we have muscle cells. They all accomplish different things. So because they accomplish different things, they're different. So our brain cells are different than our muscle cells. Our skin cells are different than our hair cells. So bottom line is, all living things are made of cells. And if you want to know more about the particulars about cells, then I would hang around for the second part of this crash course. The second characteristic of living things is that all living things need energy. So all organisms on the planet need energy to survive. So for example, plants get their energy from the sun. And animals will either get their energy from plants or they'll get energy from consuming other animals. And then we also have an example with yeast. So baker's yeast feeds off of the sugar when you make bread or cake, and it allows the dough to rise. So it feeds off that sugar, which is actually kind of cool. So that will lead us into our third characteristic of living things. So our third characteristic is that all living things exchange substances with their environment. So if we look at the previous example with the baker's yeast, it's consuming sugar and producing gas so that the dough is going to rise. So simply put, sugar in, gas out. And then when we talk about humans, we consume food and we consume water. And then as a result, we will produce feces, urine, sweat, and tears. We also will breathe in oxygen and we will expel or breathe out CO2, carbon dioxide. And what's kind of cool about that is that the plants do the opposite. And so when we have our plant here, our plant will take in the CO2 and it will expel the oxygen. So gas in, gas out. So we're always doing that exchange with our environment as living things, plants or humans. And so big or small, doesn't matter the living organism, there will always be that exchange with the environment. So our fourth characteristic is that all living things will react to stimuli. So a stimulus, which is basically in plural form stimuli, is an event, and then we respond to that event. So it's a reaction to an event. And so, for example, if I hear someone call my name, I'm turning to wherever that voice is coming from. Or if I hear a loud bang, I want to know where it comes from. And so that stimuli is the sound, and I'm responding to it. I'm reacting to it. And so whether we're talking about sound, or we're talking about touch, or we're talking about light, These are all examples of different stimuli. We also have smell and temperature, hot or cold, and then we also have pain. So these are all different types of stimuli within our environment. So giving some examples, like a dog. A dog smells a treat. It's going to go right to the owner to get that treat. Or if I stick my hand on a hot stove or a burner, I'm going to be pulling back from that because I'm responding to that extreme heat. Another example would be sunflowers. Sunflowers, or any type of flower really, points towards the sun because it wants that energy. It's responding to that stimuli. A Venus flytrap. A Venus flytrap will feel its prey. If its prey lands within its on its petals or on its branches, it's going to snap. It's going to react. So these are all examples of that interchange, that reaction to stimuli within an environment. And that's a characteristic of living things. So our fifth characteristic is that all living things grow and develop. So for example, we have a walnut, and that walnut will eventually grow into a tall walnut tree. Then we have eggs laid by a frog, and they will eventually grow into tadpoles and develop into full adult frogs. Humans will also grow and develop throughout their lifespan, from the uterus throughout their lives, throughout their development. So no matter where or what or who, all living things will continue to grow and develop. The sixth characteristic is that all living things reproduce. Now, some organisms reproduce asexually. So here I have this plant. And if I were to cut off a branch of this plant and say, repot it in a new pot with some soil, it would grow into a new adult plant that's identical to its parent. Another example of an organism that reproduces asexually is a unicellular organism. So for example, if I draw this unicellular organism here and I decide to split it in two, it will turn into two identically new bacteria. Then we also have another example, which would be sexual reproduction. So this is another type of reproduction in organisms, and it is a lot more complex. So here we have an example where obviously it's humans. We require two gametes. So this gamete and this gamete are going to combine to create what is called a zygote. And so that is an example of sexual reproduction, which is a lot more complex. And so when we're talking humans or animals or fungi, they will reproduce sexually. And then if we're talking about unicellular organisms or some plants, they will reproduce asexually. But bottom line is that all organisms reproduce. So our final characteristic is that all living things adapt and evolve. So all organisms are able to change and adapt within their environment based on climate or the food and water that's available to them. So for example, there are organisms that will hibernate or they will migrate based on the food sources that are available to them or not available to them, and whether or not the weather is too cold. And so we call these behavioral adaptations. And actually, some of these organisms can even switch between asexual and sexual reproduction depending on the situation, which is also behavioral. And then we move to the other side of my screen here, and we're going to talk about birds. And birds have feet and beaks that are very different depending on their needs. So for example, the duck has webbed feet, and those feet will be able to get them through the water and steer, etc. And their beaks are a different shape so that they can catch whatever they need for a food source. Whereas if we have the owl at the bottom of my screen here, they have talons on their feet, which help them catch their prey. And their beaks are actually a different shape than those of the duck, which help them tear apart the animals that they kill. So we have that as an example of a physical adaptation. And so both of these are ways that help animals survive and evolve. So any of these traits that work in these environments will actually be passed down throughout the generations, allowing these animals to evolve and to survive. And there you have it, our 7 characteristics of living things. And in order for something to be considered living, it has to have all 7 of those characteristics respected. So let's practice this. Drones are living things. True or false? The answer is false. So let's take a look at the 7 characteristics to see if a drone is a living thing. So the first thing is that a drone needs energy. So we're going to look at the things that give us our check marks. So a drone needs energy. It needs a power source. So whether that be a battery or electricity or gas, it needs a power source. So it does need energy. And if it's a gas-powered drone, it will exchange substances with its environment because it releases exhaust into the environment. Drones are also very intelligent, and they can be programmed to respond to certain stimuli. They can be programmed to accomplish certain commands. So that one's a check mark. But then on the other side, drones can't grow or develop. They can't reproduce, and they can't adapt or evolve. They are stagnant. They are stuck in the way that they're built. And also, they are not made of cells. They are made of metal and other industrial type of material, so they are not made of cells. So if you remember at the beginning of this video, we said that in order for something to be considered a living organism, it needs to, all of these have to have check marks, all 7 characteristics. So as you can see here, a drone is not living. Water lilies are living things. True or false? The answer is true. Once again, we will look at the 7 characteristics to see if this is in fact a living thing. So the first thing we're going to look at is that is it made of cells? And it actually is. We can see if we take a cross-section of any part of a lily, we can put it under the microscope, we will see cells. It also needs energy from the sun. So there you go. And in order for that, once it absorbs that energy, it will exchange substances with its environment in the form of photosynthesis. So what's going to happen is that it's going to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, and then it's going to release oxygen into the atmosphere. Lilies will also react to stimuli around them, including the sun. They'll move towards the warmth. We will see their flowers turn towards the sun. Another cool thing about plants, they always continue to grow and develop. So obviously a little lily will start with no flower and then eventually bloom with a flower. The lilies are also able to reproduce. They can reproduce sexually with pollinators or asexually. So if a piece breaks off and is planted somewhere else, so we know that they are able to reproduce. And lilies can also adapt and evolve. So obviously we see that lilies have a flat surface underneath so that they can float on the surface of the water and continue to survive. So as we can see here, we have all 7 characteristics. They are respected. So a lily is a living thing. So now that you know what makes a living thing, you can now hop over to the second video and take a look at what is the difference between plant and animal cells. Thanks for tuning in.